discussion after that.
Sounds good. I always like to try to plow it up a little bit just to kind of pull to the surface some of the things that we find in these chapters that we're focused on. So in this one is so the overarching theme that we've been exploring since January has been Courage, God mend all, which is the little mantra that goes with the family of the MacDonalds, which is a little acrostic of George MacDonald's name. So the themes of God taking care of things and providence and hope and courage and the dynamics of these things are recurring themes throughout his both his life and his works. So in these 5 chapters, we're beginning to explore what happens when hope is perturbed. What happens to one's faith and one's courage if your sense of hope, your resources as a person are perturbed. So this is hope under the influence of illness in particular, but disappointment can be an illness, and perhaps cause illness. We see early on him encountering that certain someone in the congregation that just rattles him, and he really wants to he feels like divesting himself of his duties, even to preach, but he pulls himself together and preaches a sermon, and then basically from there tips into an illness. So the question then, kind of to piggyback on that, is, well, what happens to your moral duty when you are ill and greatly perturbed? Does it all go out the window? And we know that for him, action is separate from feelings. We have that theme again repeated. Action is not the same thing as feeling. Feeling is not the same thing as action or faith or truth or reality. But they're not unrelated. And what he wants to say is there's a wholeness, there's an influence from feelings that should be attached. So obviously, in the romantic worldview, an action totally separated from feeling is not acceptable. That's not it. It should be a complete fitting and corresponding feeling. So an action without the feeling is incomplete. An action that has a non-corresponding or an unfitting feeling with it is also kind of an incompleteness. And he's already explored little themes off of this, like the conditions of the civilized and polished age are not necessarily directly proportional to the civility and the actions or the kindness of that age. In fact, it can be a very sinful person inside such an age, and um, often the things that we think of that are conducive to Christian morality can be the very things that are preventing the things that are the goods of the kingdom life, the reconciliation and peace. So we think of Templeton, the dissenter, in this section where he's kind of by shyness and not wanting to offend and the natural shelliness he calls of the English nature. He doesn't want to confront this dissenter that's living in his parish. But he would have reached out to him. That would have been natural to him. So we see these kind of like disconnects between the structures of the society and the outside things and the relationship to the inside things, the feelings that should be there accompanying moral duty. But what happens when the fitting feeling is absent? What happens when a negative feeling attends, right, instead, or dominates? He's already explored prejudice, unforgiveness, unchecked pride. We see how those are kind of what happens when you have this like mismatch of those feelings or those sentiments and postures. But here we're looking at illness when it robs one of one's equilibrium. So you are robbed even of your good feelings, your good intentions, perhaps even your capacities for those good feelings. So the examples are both himself when he gets ill, and you see this kind of acted out when he loses his cool in the heat of his illness with Brownrigg for compelling a church tax on the dissenter. You also see this in Stoddart, who is not himself with Judy, and with Walton, his good friend, when he's ill. So we're beginning to kind of like probe this with MacDonald. In illness, one is somehow maybe less in control, and by its very nature, you cannot muster what's required to do your duty in that state. So throughout, MacDonald's going to have a recourse to grace, God providing what we can't come up with or muster ourselves. And he has this kind of notion of hope out of nowhere, which is a recurring theme in a lot of his works. But hope out of nowhere. Let me read that little section in here at length here to kind of give you a feel of that, because he does a little rhetorical device here, kind of like I'm asking for a friend, or something like that. He says, "Well, do I remember a friend of mine telling me once. He was then a laborer in the field of literature who had not yet begun to earn his penny a day, though he worked hard, telling me how once when a hope that had kept him active for months was suddenly quenched, a book refused on which he had spent a passion of labor, the weight of money that must be paid and could not be had pressed down on him like the coffin lid that had lately covered the only friend to whom he could have applied confidently for aid, telling me, I say, how he stood at the corner of a London street with the rain dripping black from the brim of his hat, the dreariest of atmospheres about him, in the closing afternoon of the city, when the rich men were going home and the poor men who worked for them were longing to follow, and how across the waste came energy and hope into his bosom, swelling thenceforth with courage to fight and yield no ear to suggested failure. And the story would not be complete, though it is for the fact of the arrival of unexpected and apparently unfounded hope that I tell it, if I did not add that in the morning his wife gave him a letter which their common trouble of yesterday had made her forget, and which had lain with its back border all night in the darkness unopened, waiting to tell him how the vanished friend had not forgotten him on her deathbed, but had left him enough to take him out of all those difficulties and give him strength and time to do far better work than the book which had failed of birth. Some of my readers may doubt whether I am more than a wandering voice, but whatever I am, or may be thought to be, my friend's story is true. So anybody who's read Far Above Rubies will recognize that this is pure autobiography. I mean, I'm like 100% convinced this is identical to the episode where the character in Far Above Rubies, which is really MacDonald, is really in near depression at being rejected. And I put that in the comments, by the way, the entire PDF of that excerpt. So have a read through that, have a look at that, and tell me if you're also convinced that basically this is the same episode. So what we have here also, this is a kind of rhetorical devices that I'm talking about, is we're getting this muddling, which MacDonald loves to play with, is am I the narrator? Am I Walton? Am I MacDonald? And this friend, it might not be like I'm asking for a friend. It may be more like St. Paul's, 14 years ago, I knew a man who, I don't know if it was in the body or in the spirit, but he was taken up into the third heaven. I don't know, but God knows. But I know that, this man was taken up into paradise. And that I know is a rhetorical device that he's using here, that I know because, and he says, the story is true. Whoever I am as a narrator, this wandering voice, this floating voice, I know that story is true because it's my friend. It's MacDonald. So I love this. I love this playfulness, and I love that he swings back to this story, which was obviously an important one in the life of MacDonald, where he was probably really at the bottom, and we see little hints in that story of kind of suicidal ideation, and he's at the bottom, and this unlooked for hope comes to him. Some of the elements of it in the story in Far Above Rubies is that the first sign is a rainbow, and then it kind of gets transmuted in his vision to a daisy. And so that kind of like imagery, it was a daisy, it was a rainbow, and it was also a little girl, which becomes Lily in his life. But this kind of enacting of these things in symbols as hopes is another quality that MacDonald wants to use to try to talk about how these hopes are possibly sometimes signaled before they come. But regardless, they come from nowhere. They come from outside of us. We don't muster them. Um, and this hope out of nowhere is the divine grace. There are also natural graces that he wants to mention. He wants to say that um, there's a great little quote here. While those who will bravely take up their burden and bear it ask no more questions than just, is this my burden? 1,000 ministrations of nature and life will come with gentle comfortings. So he wants to be a strong advocate of the graces that come through nature and through just life, if you're prepared to see them. Um, things like rest. Poor Philip Sidney, right? Who can't sleep when he's dying. And the natural grace of sleep in his own illness. He also acknowledges that some people are just given more hope than others, a double share, a bigger proportion of courage, and that he, Walton speaking, is one such as this. So he is not as perturbed in his illness because his hope is not just around the conclusion of the illness and the healing, but around the aspects of that this perturbation of illness itself might be a catalyst for transformation. So already in this young man, we're seeing that illness is for something more, and so to look at it as if it were only about a thing to get over, or as Miss Oldcastle chastises him, are duties just things that you get rid of? And that's a self-critique, certainly in MacDonald. But is this just something you get through and then past and then it's a done thing, or is there a thing in it that can be hoped as well? It is certainly the case that illness can be a conduit of prophetic hope. So here we have this slew of fever dreams, dreams and fever dreams are both the mystical revelation and can impact motivation. So in our readings, we have this fever dream of this hunting through this complex architecture of room after room and corridor after corridor. It's a convent with some kind of house, and also the book. So he's looking through these rooms for Miss Oldcastle, and he's going to find her with a book that she's finishing. And if he doesn't hurry up and find her before she finishes the last page, he's run out of time. So here's the quote. I knew that if I did not find her before that terrible last page was read, I should never find her at all, but have to go wandering alone all my life through those dreary galleries and corridors, with one hope only left, that I might yet, before I died, find the palace chamber far apart and see the red and forsaken volume lying on the floor where she had left it, the chair beside it upon which she had so long waiting for someone in vain. So what we see here in this prophetic imagery, this symbols and dreams that affect hope, even in the thick of illness, is that they can be prophetic, they can be motivational. Obviously, what we have here is time and space, right? So the space is hunting for her all his life. The time, you're running out, she's running out of time. So we're all drawn into that haunting imagery. Then there's the other hope, in a sense, that God is orchestrating something in the weakness to his ends. So we have this example of Templeton and Walton and the reconciliation of Christian fraternity between the two of them, dissenter and the churchman. And honestly, that would not have happened. The reception of Templeton of Walton and vice versa would not have happened if he was hale and hearty. His vulnerability, his weakness was the thing that gave the opportunity to be ministered to by Templeton, and that brought a very different reception. So this kind of hint that this illness, something more is going on, there's some hope in it that is beyond our orchestration, but not beyond God's. So back to the ministrations or the natural ministrations. Here's another little quote. Almost as if I was walking in a blessed dream, come from a world of serener air than this of our own. I found, after I was already at the reading desk, that I was a few minutes early, and while with head bowed, I was simply living in the consciousness of the presence of a supreme quiet. The first notes of the organ broke upon my stillness with a sense of a deeper delight. And this obviously sets up this very significant playing of the organ. The I know my Redeemer liveth, the Handel's version of that. And later we find out that it's Miss Oldcastle playing, which obviously raises the stakes even more about the significance of this. But this is in that category of someone else from outside is bringing us hope. Someone else is a minister, like an angel, bringing us something that we don't have within ourselves. So, for one, is the initial state of consciousness, which is basically this kind of resting in the presence of supreme quiet, which is a great description of peace. But then this peace kind of added to by the ministrations of the organist. So there are human instruments of hope. And he unpacks this with Miss Oldcastle in person when he asks her, what's the greatest gift one could give another? And that's this placing of hope of God directly into the heart of the other, kind of like the angels do. He says it this way: it must be something imperishable if you give something that's a divine gift, something which in its own nature is. If instead of a gem or even a flower, we could cast the gift of a lovely thought into the heart of our friend, that would be giving, as the angels, I suppose, must give. So this is this divine and kind of mystical ministrations from other people. Now, this is also echoed in his other works, and people who have read Lilith will recognize that this very thing happens when he becomes disembodied at the end, that he becomes capable in this kind of state before he's rebodied to speak good words and thoughts directly into the hearts of his friends. So that's what he says is happening with this someone playing I know my Redeemer liveth, because it's placing hope in his heart that wasn't there at all before. And then, of course, once he knows it's Miss Oldcastle, it's even more profound. So we're beginning to kind of tease apart this attitude then that maybe, or the fear in a way that the morality is tied to these moods. And what should we despair? That our goodwill will only be present under certain circumstances. Like when we become ill, when we lose ourselves, will our good character, will our the goods that we hope for, will they remain? And this is, of course, Stoddard. He says, it's humiliating to think that illness should so completely overcrow me that I am no more myself, lose my hold, in fact, of what I call me, so that I am almost driven to doubt my personal identity. And that's the depth of what he's trying to probe here. And the philosophy of this is fleshed out in the dialogue at the end with Stoddard. So he begins to kind of tease apart what he really believes about it. It's a little sermon kind of in the end, in a dialogue form. But first he differentiates the insides and the outsides, right? That was your illness. That was not you. And there are behaviors and things on the outside of us and influences that actuate us, which is an interesting word, is a passive kind of sense of the agency of the person, right? So things that actuate us or act upon us versus the agency of the self, which is choosing. And the self is obviously the spirit in the MacDonald worldview. So he says, as if life were a conflict between the inner force of the spirit, which lies in its faith in the unseen, and the outer force of the world, which lies in the pressure of everything it has to show us. The material operating upon the senses is always asserting its existence, and if our inner life is not equally vigorous, we should be moved, urged, that is, called actuated from without, whereas all our activity ought to be from within. But sickness not only overwhelms the mind, but vitiating all the channels of the senses causes them to represent things as they are not, of which misrepresentations the presence, persistency, and iteration seduce the man to act from false suggestions instead of from what he knows and believes. There we have the kind of romantic philosophy of this relationship then between the insides and the outsides. One ought to be moved from pure agency, which is the spirit. One is not. But how is it that the outsides intervene in pure spirit? How do they do that? Well, they do that through lie, through misrepresentation, through the knowledge first, right? So they are presenting things to our spirits that are misrepresented, and we respond to those misrepresentations through that form. Then our actions then become wrong, misaligned. So it's interesting here, and this is, we can debate about whether or not that's the case. There is a kind of sequential thought in MacDonald of like, yes, the spirit, and then the knowledge, and then the actions, and it's always kind of in that linear kind of relationship. But here he's suggesting that the intervention of things on the outside is the thing that introduces what's not true. And therefore, if not true, then we're not acting in alignment with what we believe and what is real, our faith. So the pressures from without act within via knowledge, by misrepresentation, and illness messes up the channels of the senses. It doesn't mess up the spirit, messes up the channels of the senses. And a healthy mind operates, therefore, in good faith, right? So that is unimpeded and can perceive what is true, can discern, and can act upon it. So outside of the man have to be met by the inner confidence of the spirit, resting in God and resisting every impulse to act according to what appears to it instead of what it believes. So there he's testing out the difference not just between reality and appearances, but asserting the power of faith to strengthen the spirit to act upon real faith rather than by appearance. So in The Fairy Queen, he's got a little quote there, which I feel is an expression of the ideal, the romantic ideal. That horror made to all that did behold, but she no whit did change her constant mood. So we see this queen holding a goblet and drinking out of it, and her behavior is not changed, even though there's a snake inside it, and it doesn't perturb her. So here's the ideal poetically expressed, that one could keep one's cool, one's mood, and uphold one's duty in spite of the even horrific perturbances. He goes on to talk about, because Stoddard wants to know, but how? How do we keep our cool? How do we stay in this? And he says you need more than correct belief and theory. You need the practice of the love of neighbor. Things will readily be misaligned in relationships with other people. So that is the testing ground and the school of the love of God, to love your neighbor. This is modeled in Walton and the Doctor discussing Old Roger's employment, but probably best captured in this little summary right at the end. Nothing, I repeat, so much as a humble ministration to your neighbors will help you to that perfect love of God, which casteth out fear. Nothing but the love of God that God revealed in Christ will make you able to love your neighbor aright. And the Spirit of God, which alone gives might for any good, will by these loves, which are life, strengthen you at last to believe in the light, even in the midst of darkness, to hold the resolution formed in health, when sickness has altered the appearance of everything around you, and to feel tenderly towards your fellow, even when you yourself are plunged in dejection and racked with pain. He's obviously suggesting now that all this basically lands with the gracious Spirit of God, empowering us to see, to know, to believe, and to do the good aright, even when illness and pain obscure with false appearance and rob us of our capacities. It is also God who ultimately heals, contrary to his age. It is not the medicine as the causal healer, but God in person caring for us in all of this. So that's a kind of picture overview of what I think he's trying to get us to explore, all around this big theme of how do you keep your faith, your cool, your hope, your faith, and your morality, your duty, even in the perturbation of illness. How do we not be perturbed?